Welcome to the Woman Warriors Podcast. You worry, I worry, we all do. If you're paying attention to the world today, there's a lot for women to feel worried and anxious about. As we explore the worries with curiosity and compassion, we learn to live more authentically and unleash the warrior within, someone who is strong, capable, and resilient, come what may. It's time to stop battling against yourself and start using your powers to meet everyday challenges with energy, purpose, and bravery. Now here's your host, Elizabeth Cush.
Hi, and welcome back to the Woman Warriors Podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cush, and I am excited to share with you our most popular episode of 2020 this week. So instead of doing a new episode, I'm going to reshare the most downloaded episode for the year. I know it's been a tough year, and just looking back, trying to focus on some of the positives, even though it's been so hard. And I know that by intentionally thinking about more positive things, I'm also being very aware that there was some messed up shit this year. So I hope 2021 is a better year, and we will be having new episodes again after this, but also I will be sharing some other episodes, maybe the most downloaded episode of all time, or just something that feels relevant to our experience this past year. So this week, I am re-releasing my discussion, my talk, my interview with Dr. Sarah McKay. She's a neuroscientist in Australia, and we dove deep into women's bodies, our hormones, how hormones impact how we feel. But there were also some unexpected ideas, results from her research that she discusses here on the podcast, that maybe it's not all about the hormones. Maybe there's a lot of what's happening for us as women that includes social messaging, expectations, how we feel about our bodies. So I hope you'll enjoy this re-release. I found her to be incredibly easy to talk to, a great conversationalist, funny, and she has a wealth of information that she shared with us here. So Dr. Sarah McKay sums up her research with the words nature, nurture, and neuroplasticity. Sarah is a neuroscientist and science communicator who specializes in translating brain science research into simple, actionable strategies for peak performance, creativity, health, and well-being. As the director of the Neuroscience Academy, Sarah offers training in applied neuroscience and brain health for helping professionals. Sarah has authored the popular science book, The Woman's Brain Book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones, and Happiness, which explores women's health from womb to tomb through the lens of neurobiology. In 2019, she hosted an episode of ABC's flagship science TV show, Catalyst, exploring biohacking, brain health, and longevity. Sarah grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, and after completing her neuroscience degree at Otago University, she won a scholarship to Oxford University for her PhD training. After 5 years of medical research in Sydney, Australia, Sarah hung up her lab coat to build an online science communications business. She combines a wry sense of humor with an uncompromising mind. Whether she is writing or speaking on the TEDx stage, she tells science stories in a fun and compelling way. She's been featured in print media such as the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and the Sydney Morning Herald, and can be seen or heard on SBS Insight, ABC Radio National, ABC Catalyst, and Channel 7 Mornings in Australia. Sarah lives on the northern beaches of Sydney, Australia with her Irish husband, and together they're raising 2 boys and a Cocker Spaniel, and they can be found sailing, surfing, mountain biking, or skiing. Here's my conversation with Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the Woman Warriors Podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. I love your podcast. You do really important work, so I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And it's interesting because for such a long time, I have wanted to find someone who could talk to me about, yeah, how our brain and body work and like why women's brains do what they do. I mean, why our female bodies do what they do. So I'm very excited about our conversation. But before we get started, I
Mhm.
just want to hoping you will talk a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to do this work and to write this book.
Yeah, sure. Well, I live in Sydney, Australia, but I'm actually a New Zealander. So I grew up in New Zealand, which I think has gained a bit of recognition recently because we have a really fantastic Prime Minister and she's done a lot for putting Kiwi women on in the headlines. So we're very proud of who we are and where we're from. And I certainly was incredibly fortunate to
Mm,
grow up in that part of the world because it's very down to earth and very real. And I like to think that that's still who I am. Now, I had a very happy childhood, grew up in a lovely family, lots of love. And I was one of those kids that always had my head in a book, just always enjoyed reading and learning. And I loved school
mm.
all the way through high school. Was toying with various kinds of careers as you do if you're a bit of an overachieving teenage girl, and headed off to university. And I was sort of doing what we call in New Zealand at that time, it was like a sort of a health sciences first year to take you down into lots of the sort of the medical health science disciplines, and was doing psychology lecture and read a book by a chap called Oliver Sacks, who was a neurologist, and he wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Now, I don't know whether you know the book. Yeah,
I remember hearing about it in school
yeah, and
myself.
he and it was really it's an extraordinary book, and he writes. He's a wonderful writer and writes a series of case studies about people with very bizarre neurological disorders. And I was utterly captivated by that. And this is back in the early 90s. And I remember saying to a friend who was doing a lot of the same subjects, and I said, "Oh, look, I'm so interested in this kind of the brain and psychology and the biology of psychology." And he said, "Oh, well, there's this brand new degree discipline at another university down come 4 hours away from where I lived called neuroscience." And I was like, "Huh, well, that sounds really
Hmm.
interesting." So I went down to that uni and checked it out, and it really pulled together the neuroscience component from pharmacology and physiology and anatomy and psychology and psychiatry. And I was like, this is my thing. So I transferred to that university, and was one of the first cohort to go through and gain a degree in neuroscience from that university. Loved every second of it. And
Wow.
it's really sort of been the path that I have never ever deviated from since. It's such an incredibly broad, deep, and rich subject. There's no way that you can ever know everything there is to know. So, especially for someone like me, where I have just such a deep love of learning, it's a perfect discipline to be in. I was incredibly fortunate then to head off. I went off traveling around with my friends around Europe with a backpack, as you did back in the early 90s, with $100 in my back pocket type of thing. And I was very fortunate to win a scholarship to Oxford University to study my master's, and then I did my PhD there as well.
Wow.
And when I was there, the research field that I was working in, I was really interested in brain development, and in particular the role of sort of nature versus nurture, although that's quite an old-fashioned way to think about it now. But I was interested in how the experiences that we have guide how the brain wires up during development. And now we'd be more familiar with concepts such as using words like neuroplasticity. But even back then, back at the turn of the century, they weren't
Right.
necessarily phrases that we used. But that's essentially what I was looking at, was how plastic the brain is during early development. And it's interesting for me because that now is a topic that there's such great thirst and interest for in the wider world. So when I was in Oxford, I met a gorgeous Irishman, and we was 20
Hmm.
odd years later or something, we're married now with a couple of kids. And on a bit of a whim, back in 2002, we decided to go and live in Sydney, Australia for a year because we thought it sounded sunny, and we were really outdoorsy. We like, great outdoors and sailing and beaches and
Yeah.
surfing. And that was sort of, we
Yeah.
told his Irish mother that we were going for a year. That was in 2002, and we're still here. And yeah, and very
Wow. Wow.
obviously, where are we now? It's, as we're recording this, it's the end of March 2020. We can't get to the beach as much as we would like. Life is very different for us at this moment in time, but we've had a really fantastic, we enjoy living in Sydney a lot. That's why we've never left. And really in the last kind of 10 or 12 years, I did about 5 years research in the universities here in Sydney, carrying on my work looking at plasticity and how the brain changes. And then I set up my own business about 12 years ago because I saw a real gap between what we were doing and the work that we were doing in the research lab and what people wanted to use and apply in their lives. And so I've been doing that since, really working, sort of taking the neuroscience, what can we do, what can we understand, and how can I use that to help people in some meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, and for your book, The Woman's Brain, you did a lot of research, just sort of initially looking at, are women's brains different than men's brains? And, there's this whole, what was it? Men are from Mars, women, or whatever it is. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or on, like we're so different. But are we really biologically or neurologically so different?
That's a really good question, because when I started writing the book, I really went into it, having written a piece for it in the ABC here in Australia on menopause and brain fog, and then thinking, wow, instead of chatting with a publisher, talking about menopause and pregnancy and puberty, and thinking, oh, would it be really interesting to write a book about the neurobiology of periods and the pill and pregnancy? And so it was very much a book taking a look at women's health. But as soon as I said I was writing a book on, if I used the words the female brain instead of women's health, the first question I'd be asked was, how different are male and female brains? Or you'd get some bloke saying, oh, can you tell me how to understand my wife? Or and all of this kind of thing. And it was curious to me because I wasn't writing a book about that. I was writing about puberty and the pill and periods. But anyway, I guess, we all quite like this idea that we can kind of put all men over this side of the room and all women over that side of the room, have kind of a pink side and a blue side based on what's inside our skulls. And if we kind of open up our skulls, we could see these pink brains and women and blue brains and men. And we're really captivated by these findings of sex and gender differences, especially when they've got a very seductive brain-based explanation, or neurosplaining as I call it. But it doesn't turn out that way when we start doing really careful studies looking at the structure, the gross structure, just look at a brain from the outside, or zoom in with a microscope and look at the microarchitecture. And then when we start looking at various thoughts or feelings or behavings, it's not as easy as you might intuitively think to divide brains into pink and blue at all. And one concept that's come out of a lot of the literature is this idea of a mosaic brain, whereby we've all got so many differences in our brains, and some women may have a brain that's made up of lots of pink and blue and purple and mauve and violet parts, but so might a lot of men. And we simply can't say all brains are this way and all brains are that way. And instead, we need to start asking ourselves, what is this particular difference we are curious about exploring between males and females? How different is that difference really when it comes down to it? Because typically it turns out that the differences are very, very, very small and there's massive overlap. And it turns out that brains aren't actually that different at all. Some parts of brains in women are different from men. For example, women have a part of the brain that controls ovulation. Of course, men don't have that part of the brain, but the vast majority of our brains are devoted to interpreting what we see, to processing sound and movement and interacting with other people and thinking about solving maths equations if you're at primary school, or learning a musical instrument, or patting your dog, or cooking a meal, or smelling food and enjoying someone else's company. All of these things we all do. They're not gender specific. So, and I also think because of the vast majority of the work I did when I was working in the research lab, was taking a look at this concept of plasticity. So much of our brains are shaped by our lives and the experiences that we have. And children are born into a gendered world. And I know in the US, a lot of people are quite fond of having these gender reveal parties.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of think they're a bit ridiculous, because they're not, it's almost like the baby's life is determined before they're born based on whether they're pink or blue. And every experience that we have, particularly through childhood, shapes and sculpts our brains and teaches that child, this is who you are in the world in which you're born into. Because a plastic brain essentially is built so that it can adapt to the world in which it lives. And if children are born up in a very gendered way, and that's, I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, then of course the brain is going to learn to behave in a certain way. So much of who we are depends on the experiences we have. So it's way more complicated than a male brain's different to female brains. Are all men different to all women? When it comes down to it, well, I mean, mostly we're more similar than different, aren't we?
Yeah. But I think to your point that, if we have been born into a very gendered society from a very young age, we are picking up and modeling and behaving in these ways that, these are the ways boys behave. These are the ways girls behave. And it just sort of becomes part of who we are.
Exactly. There's a really interesting study I talk about in the book, I'm so grateful it was published when it was. It was looking at this and we would see this in adults, and particularly in, Western world where we see it everywhere, actually. It's not just the Western, we've seen it forever. And it's that old Sheryl Sandberg encouraging women to lean in, because men are the ones that are more likely to put their hand up, put themselves forward, be very confident, whereas women are far more kind of self-deprecating and less likely to ask for the raise, put their hand up in a room. And I see this all the time when I talk. I do a lot of public speaking. We have Q&A. The men always put their hands up first. And as soon as you start answering the men's questions, the women are less likely to.
Wow.
Now, that male self-confidence and belief in themselves starts at quite a young age. So these researchers are interested, when does that begin? Is it a hormonal thing? Do we see it emerge at adolescence? We see it a lot earlier when hormones aren't doing anything. So you go into a classroom of boys and girls at around age 5, so very beginning of primary school, or elementary school as you call it, and say, hey, I have a board game that's designed for really clever kids. Who wants to learn how to play? It's a smart kids game. And all the boys will go, me, and all the girls will go, me. But then you go on and talk to the 7 and 8-year-olds and say, who wants to play the game for smart kids? The boys go, me, and a lot of the girls go, oh, that's the game for the boys. Smart kids are the boys. Similarly, you could present them with a story about, if you frame it in terms of what is important to the kids. So you could say, who is the scientist who's going to save the world from coronavirus, or who's going to help stop climate change? Who could grow up to be a scientist like that? And the boys will go, me, and the girls will go, me. When they're about 5, get to ages 7 and 8, the boys will go, oh, well, I could do that. And the girls will go, well, that's what the boys are going to grow up to do. So they're picking up these messages that the boys can be the ones that can be confident, go forward and put their hands up, and the girls kind of defer to them. And they're learning it at a very young age. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think it's really important we realise how early these tendencies emerge. And it's not to say, oh, it's teachers or it's parents, we shouldn't educate children. Look what they learn. But, they pick this stuff up from the experiences that they have. And it's hard to unlearn that as an adult woman.
Oh, for sure. Oh, my goodness, for sure. I know that I went back to grad school much later, like in my 50s. And I can remember being self-conscious about being the woman who is raising her hand. Like,
you're probably sitting in the front row.
Probably.
That's what you do when you're an adult student. You go back to uni, you sit in the front row, and you're enthusiastic.
Exactly.
So I
had all the questions, and then I began to get very self-conscious. I'm like, okay,
the men probably don't feel as self-conscious because they haven't learned that what is important is to be polite and demure, and and that's not an innate thing, because we see it emerging in those early childhood years. So I think it's useful for us to understand that, because in that we go, well, I learned that behaviour.
Yes.
I can learn new behaviour, and isn't that powerful to know that you can change?
Absolutely. Yes. And that's the amazing thing. That's what I just love about all this neuroplasticity research, that we can change, our brains can change, and we can learn to be different. But I also found in your book so interesting the research you did around our cycles. And I know so many women that I see in therapy and in my life, friends, even I experience, like, it feels as if our cycles control our mental health sometimes.
Yes.
But what did you find in the research around that?
This is really, really, for me, one of the this is a real game changer when I was writing the book, because it came early on, because I kind of went in utero childhood, puberty, and then I was going to have the menstrual cycle is and within puberty. And then I was like, it needs a whole chapter of its own. So it was early on in writing the book.
Yeah.
I came across some interesting research, and I very much went into thinking this is going to be a book about biology and how our hormones did influence how we think and feel. And so I thought, well, but I started taking a look at across the menstrual cycle. We think, oh, well, if you're not on the pill or menopausal or pre-pubertal, you've got a menstrual cycle happening. And so a lot of women can think of it as a monthly neuroscience experiment. And I thought, well, does it influence how we think, our cognitive abilities? And I was delighted to find zero support for that notion. No, it doesn't matter what time of the month it is. We're perfectly able to think and reason and judge and make decisions and plan and be strategic, which I'm so fortunate growing up in the part of the world I did, and that we've always had a lot of women in positions of power and in politics. And I was like, well, of course we can. I knew that.
Right. But
taught me that.
Also nice to have it validated by research.
Validated by neuroscience.
Yes.
But women who have jobs know that,
yes.
right? We're perfectly capable humans.
Yes.
And then I thought, well, what about emotions? They're different. Because a lot of us grow up with this story, well, yes, we're on this roller coaster of hormones that we can't really get off, and they control our emotional life. Mm-hmm. So I thought, oh, well, I'll look at PMS or PMT, that kind of, and I was really interested in that kind of moodiness, crankiness, that women describe before they get their period. Now, I must add that I've been on the pill for many years, but when I wasn't on the pill, I never really suffered from PMS. It wasn't really kind of part of my personal experience. Mm-hmm. But that aside, I thought, well, it's meant to be very common. So I went and I found a meta-analysis, which, if you're familiar or not with how research is done, a meta-analysis pulls together a lot of research, different research studies. And so there's power in numbers. We can make more certain assumptions based on more data. Mm-hmm. And this study was looking at rates of reported PMS and emotional symptoms in women in different countries in the world. It's fascinating. So if you went to France and Switzerland, about 10 or 15% of women said, yes, I suffer from PMS. Jump over the border from France into Spain, still in Europe, about 50% of Spanish women say they suffer from PMS. Varies all the way around the world. And you go into some countries, for example, Iran and the Middle East, about 90 to 95% of women there said, yes, they suffer from PMS. And I was like, well, isn't that curious? Because hormones don't vary that much, and they certainly don't vary that much between France and Spain, but cultures and societies differ greatly. So what is influencing women to have these different experiences of PMS? So I started speaking to a women's health psychiatrist in New Zealand, who's also called Sarah Romans, and she thought the same. She said, she's obviously seeing a particular subset of women who have serious mental health issues. They're coming to a psychiatrist. But she said they were all coming to me and defaulting to their reproductive capacity. I am a woman, I'm ruled by my hormones. And she said, I just didn't think that was the case for them all. And she was familiar with these variations in PMS rates around the world and designed a study called the Mood and Daily Life Study. And so women had kind of an app that popped up on their phone, and every day they had to record the daily menstrual cycle, their current emotional status, and they were given a range of positive and negative and neutral emotions to choose from, and the same number of each, so the data wasn't skewed to only negative emotions and maybe happy,
right?
Which a lot of studies are, as if we have 12 negative emotions and one positive. How stressed they felt, how socially supported or not, their kind of social status. And what was really telling them this was that they were not told it was a study looking at PMS symptoms. Hundreds of women in the study, many, many hundreds of cycles gathered, and the data was crunched. And it turned out that there were some women whose emotional status was determined by their hormonal status, by the day of the month. But it was a very small number. It was only about 1 to 2 in 20 women.
Wow.
So about 5 to 10% of women. The rest of the women, day of the cycle didn't have any influence on their emotional status. And this is interesting, but when you do a different type of study and you tell the woman, this is a study looking at emotions and PMS, you get a very different data set. So when you're not priming people's expectations about their health outcomes, you see very, very different data. What is interesting, I was talking to Sarah about this on the phone. She said, it's so interesting. What was the key indicators of women's emotional status? How stressed they felt was important. Their physical health on that day was important. But the key indicator of their emotional health and well-being was how socially supported they felt. Did they have someone that they could call on if they needed it? Did they feel loved and cared for and nurtured by someone else? And that was an absolute turning point in writing this book, because I started to see this pattern emerge when we're talking about girls entering puberty. What was the determinant on how emotionally traumatic it was? Did they go on to develop anxiety and depression as they went through puberty? It depended on the social context in which they were in. Were they going through puberty at the same time as their friends? They were going through much earlier. They were more vulnerable. Boys going through puberty earlier than their friends get bigger, hairier, musclier, taller. They rise in social status. They're protected than the little guys. What is one of the greatest determinants of a woman's postnatal experience, whether she develops postnatal depression? It's how socially supported she feels. It's that old story about who's in the village.
Yeah.
We look at menopause. Obviously, that's a really emotional and difficult time for lots of women, but how socially supported a woman feels, how physically well she is, all of that is as much of an indicator to her experience as her hormonal fluctuations. And I saw that time and time and time again through the book.
Wow.
Every researcher I spoke to said the same thing. I would say, how can we help a woman who's gone through pregnancy? How can we help a little girl entering puberty? How can we help someone who's suffering from anxiety and depression? And what would every single researcher, every single specialist in the field, they'd be like, oh, well, it's about the social support. It's about other people. It's about love. It's about connection.
Wow. It makes so much sense. I mean, you think about how, well, as you know, going into puberty with no social support, no, whether it's a parent or a sibling or an aunt or whatever, sort of guiding you through this is like, this is normal. This is what's going to happen. And this is
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a time, you go through puberty, and those of us who've gone through it can remember it very clearly. Most women can very clearly remember the day they first got their period.
Yeah.
It's really embedded in your memory.
Yeah.
And your experience of that largely depends on how well prepared you were. And the only way to be prepared is by other people giving you that information. How normal was that for you? And also what was happening in your friendship groups at that time. And it's so normal for young people, boys and girls, to sort of pull away from the family and focus on friends. And that's biologically normal.
Right.
It's what young people should be doing. And so that social group just is so vital at that point in time. And if you feel different, that is going to have a very powerful outcome on your emotional experience. So when we tend to focus on hormones all the time, and they play a role, but they're not the loudest voice in the crowd.
Yeah.
Every one of our emotional experiences. And I think that is such good news.
Well,
because again, we can do a lot about a lot of things. We can't do, if you're a female and you've got a menstrual cycle, that's kind of what you've got. You can take care of your health, but you can't necessarily, unless you're perfectly happy to go on the pill like I've always been, change your hormonal fluctuations. So we've got so much choice and agency over our emotional responses. We're not on a roller coaster that we can't get off. And I think that's, for me, was a real surprise when I wrote the book, that was what kept coming up time and time again.
Yeah. And I think you do say in the book too, that there are people that do have, I'm forgetting the letters, but severe.
Yeah, premenstrual dysmorphic disorder, so PMDD, which is a severe type of PMS. And that's what I said. And even in the careful studies that were done, for example, with Sarah Romans and the Mood and Daily Life, there were a subset of women who were far more sensitive.
Yeah.
But most women were not. And it's like what we see when we look at women around the world. What was the influence on that? Is the kind of the narratives and the storytelling that emerges within a group of women, within a society, within a particular culture. And that was a stronger influence on women's PMS symptoms than hormones. It's the stories that if you've been brought up to expect that you're going to suffer from PMS, perhaps your mother did, or your mother was told that she would, and you're told, well, 1 week a month you're going to feel pretty rubbish. And interestingly, if you look into all of the feminist literature, we see a very, very similar story emerge in that space, and that PMS is just women are given permission to say what they think and feel for 1 week a month. The rest of the 3 weeks we are keeping ourselves quiet, because that's what we've been told we should do.
Interesting.
So I think that's really interesting. And it's not to say that hormones don't influence how we feel. but perhaps not as much as we may have been taught. And I think that that's quite a powerful message.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so now I want to shift to, sort of older. I'm just talking about myself feeling older, but
Oh, that's I like that one.
perimenopause, perimenopause, menopause.
Yeah.
So I can recall before, I guess I knew I was in perimenopause, but just really feeling as if like I was pre-dementia. Like I can remember calling my sister who's older than me and saying like, I'm not sure what's happening. Like I was also a little depressed and there was a lot going on. And she had some friends who were older and she's like, I think this is what's happening for you. This is part of the menopausal experience. And I've had clients share that with me as well. And so
Yeah.
do hormones, our changing hormonal fluctuations impact our cognitive stuff or how we're feeling in the world during?
Well, that's really interesting because that was what was kind of the spark for writing this book. Was I wrote an article on menopause, perimenopause and brain fog, and that many women do experience kind of, they become fuzzy and forgetful and moody and think, oh, that's the first signs of Alzheimer's and dementia, and get very, very fearful about that.
Yeah.
It's a very, very common experience. And I have a friend who I studied with in Oxford who is an Alzheimer's disease researcher. And the same thing happened to her. She became so concerned that she was experiencing Alzheimer's symptoms. And she's an expert in the field. She went to her GP and the GP said, I think it might be perimenopause. And what turns out what is happening in perimenopause is we have these huge surges and kind of a real bumpy ride of hormones where it's almost like our ovaries are trying to get those last bit of the conversation going with the brain. And we know estrogen, there are estrogen receptors in our brain. Our ovaries produce estrogen. Usually TikToks along quite regularly most of our lives, and then we get to perimenopause and it does fluctuate wildly. And it turns out it's that fluctuation that has an effect. Now, again, I was like, well, does the fluctuation have a direct effect on some of the symptoms women experience? And there's a real chicken and egg scenario in here because by far and away the most common symptom that women experience in the perimenopause, and of course this is the years leading up to your final period. It could be 4, 5, 6, 8 years, and I'm 45, so I'm right in the middle of it. The most common symptom is hot flashes, getting all hot and sweaty, or night sweats.
Oh yeah.
And in particular, when we experience night sweats or hot flashes at night, it disrupts our sleep. It wakes us up completely, or it brings us out of deep sleep. And it may be that it is the sleep disruption that is causing a lot of the other issues. When you're not getting a good full night's sleep, you feel far less control over your emotions. Maybe that leads to women at our age, in our late 40s, we've got teenage kids, we've got aging parents. Right now, we've got this global pandemic.
Yeah.
We're often at the peak of our careers. We've got a lot going on. And if you're not getting good sleep, because perhaps you're having hot flashes at night, perhaps that's what's causing a lot of problems. So it's a real chicken and egg scenario. We don't really understand what's causing what, like kind of where in the line these things are happening. But we know the hot flash is definitely directly attributable to the fluctuating hormones, because if you treat women with HRT, or myself, I went back on the oral contraceptive pill because I was having hot flashes at night, not during the day. But like last winter, I was boiling hot and I was sweating, and I'd kick the covers off and fall back asleep, and then I'd wake up and I was freezing cold. The winter, the covers on, and this went on for a few months, and I was like, I can't be perimenopausal. But I went and saw my OBGYN, and she was like, well, I think you are. She said, how about you go back on the oral contraceptive pill, because you're still getting your periods every month.
Right.
And I was like, okay, fine. And what that does, and lots of women don't feel comfortable with this, but I certainly did it, kind of flatlines that fluctuation of hormones. It gives you lots of estrogen. And within a month, I was back to sleeping. I've always been the world's best sleeper, sleeping all night again, not waking up sweating.
Yeah.
My skin was amazing. And my hairdresser said to me the other day, she said, there's something about your hair that's changed in the last year. It's much thicker, because I've always had quite fine hair. She said, your hair is much thicker.
Huh.
So that's probably the effects of estrogen and the pill for me.
Yeah.
So, I'm not saying this is not my prescription. I'm not a doctor. I'm just talking about my personal experience here. But it gave me a bit of control back. Lots of women feel very fearful about taking hormone replacements, whether it be the pill if you're perimenopausal or HRT, perhaps a bit further down the track, because there's a great deal of fear around that. But certainly we know if your symptoms are hot flashes, we understand a little bit about the neurobiology of that too. So there's a region in your brain called the hypothalamus, which controls lots of things, body temperature being one. And when estrogen levels start declining, it's like a thermostat. It gets a bit narrower. So the top temperature goes down, the bottom temperature goes up, and you only need a much smaller shift in body temperature to suddenly feel like you're incredibly hot. If we introduce estrogen back into the system, if you're still perimenopausal, there are no health risks, so long as you don't have a history of breast cancer and whatnot. And that's something every woman has to manage with their own healthcare provider. But if you introduce estrogen back, HRT or perhaps the oral contraceptive pill, the thermostat kind of goes back to its original setting and you don't get as hot again.
Wow.
So we understand the neurobiology of that quite well now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty amazing how easily things can sort of get disrupted through hormones and changing, and just to change our internal body temperature is just pretty crazy.
Oh, for sure. But I mean, I think certainly for me, I felt very well educated on this subject. And there's a lot of fear around HRT that came from the studies that were done kind of back at the turn of the century, 2002, 2003, the women's health studies came out.
Oh, I remember. It was
everyone kind of went off HRT globally, because a lot of large studies have been done looking at women taking HRT, and it looked like a lot of diseases, increased cancers and heart disease, etc. And so the studies were stopped and people became very, very fearful about HRT almost overnight. And it's really interesting now, those studies have been looked at in a great deal of more detail. And a lot of women were entering these studies. About half of the women in the studies were put on HRT when they were in their 50s, 60s and even 70s. So 10, 20, even 30 years after they had gone through menopause. And it was those subset of women who had estrogen reintroduced back into their system, sometimes decades after they'd weaned off it. Those were the women that showed the increased risk of these various health issues. Women who were put on HRT or whatever medication it was for their symptoms, if they were symptomatic and they started taking it when they were symptomatic, perimenopausal, or within a year or two of the menopause, we don't see the same increased risk in those women. And it was the older ladies who skewed the data. They should never have been put on it. And that has since been validated quite well in a lot of animal studies. You can go in and validate a lot of this. We can look at, menopausal animals in the lab, menopausal mice. And we see when you reintroduce estrogen into a system, that's when it causes the damage. So there was a lot of fear back then, rightly so at that point, because we didn't understand the data well enough. And now we've looked back on that. There's a generation of women who've been scared off HRT, but what I certainly see now is amongst my group of friends who are all in our mid-late 40s, certainly here in Australia at least, those messages are through and women are feeling much more comfortable. There's not the fear. The medical profession is really educated on all of this data now, and we've got options now if we so choose, which is a really positive thing.
It really is. It really is, because I definitely got hot flashes, but it didn't. Maybe it was disrupting my life more than I realized, but it was okay. But I have a few friends who it stops them from sleeping. It's making them, and so they've been able to go on HRT and really it changed their lives. It changed their lives.
It does change lives. One researcher I said to, he said, I have women who are going through menopause giving up work. He said, but I have cancer patients who carry on working. It's nice to have some options. So you're like, right now, there's enough disruption going on. So I think whatever we can manage, we should manage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to just say that I loved, I think you had one section about menopause and like, why do we as humans have this long life after no longer being able to birth children and be
Yeah,
reproductive.
yeah.
And you talk about the orca whales, and
I know, that's a beautiful idea, isn't it?
it is. It is. Will you talk a little bit about that and
Yeah,
what you
well,
shared?
it's this lovely notion that I came across. It's like in almost every mammal in the animal kingdom, we like to look to the animal kingdom to see, because we are part of the animal kingdom too.
Yeah.
And as I often say, the animal kingdom doesn't read books on what to expect when they're expecting. And as it turns out, that's a pretty powerful indicator of, but why we looked at all of the rest of the animal kingdom, but apart from humans and a couple of species of whale, once you go through menopause, you die pretty much straight away. So you end up, your reproductive years are kind of over, and then that's it for you because you're kind of dispensable.
Right.
But what is it about humans and orca whales? And I think it's also pilot whales, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Why do we kind of carry on living? And there's this lovely notion been studied in these whale populations that it's this kind of like this grandmother theory or this wise matriarch theory that having a woman with wisdom that she's gathered up over years of life experience who's no longer fertile, so her time is not taken up with raising children, but she has wisdom to impart to the community in which she lives, then that promotes survival within that community of the young people coming through. In the whale populations, we would see that with the wise menopausal matriarch whale, she's the one that knows where to find food when times are tough. And the pods that have those wise postmenopausal matriarchs are healthier and survive for longer, and there's more survival of the young. They're able to find food. So it's whether or not we can. It's just kind of coincidence, but there is this
but I like that.
that we postmenopausal women, we have knowledge and experience that we've built up over many years, and when we're no longer raising our children, we can move on to a really new role in society. And gosh, there's a need for warmth and wisdom and empathy and kindness and leadership. Right now, men can do that, but they don't seem to be doing that great a job, a lot of them. But there's this, there's all these wonderful women out there I know. And I often think about, if people know Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, gosh, she's just epitomises warmth and kindness and clean, clear, warm, nurturing leadership.
Yeah.
And I know so many women like her, but we just don't have that confidence to put up our hands and lead.
Yeah.
And there's, gosh, we're all missing out.
I know.
By women not having the confidence to do what someone like Jacinda does, when we've got that ability. We just need to step up a bit.
Well, and the hard part here, especially in my country, the United States, like the women that do rise to the top tend to be the women who have learned to sort of do politics or leadership in a very male way, because that's how they got, they are confident, and then they're then shamed and, they're the bitch, they're the whatever.
Yeah. It's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
But people also seem to weirdly then have such great reverence for someone like the Queen.
Right.
Like Crown is one of like the top shows to watch on Netflix, and people just think, and they're perfectly happy to look to someone like the Queen with reverence and respect.
Yeah.
And so there are ways that women can lead, I think.
I believe for sure. Absolutely.
We just don't, sometimes we just don't seem to think that they can. But I think also we need to just, there's lots of ways that we can do that. That's not in politics. It's not just becoming president or prime minister.
Right.
There's lots of ways that we can all do that within our own communities. And that's kind of where you've got to start, I think.
I think so too. So if you wanted the listeners of the podcast to take away something, what would be from your book? What would that, if there's a nugget?
Look, definitely this idea, like if I had to give a prescription, it would be a social prescription. And it didn't matter whether it's, a newborn baby, what does it need more than anything? A little kid starting school, young people, girl getting her period for the first time, or going through those teenage years, new mums, just women in midlife who are kind of confused. older women, people in aged care, what does everyone need? And it's that social prescription. And that is one of and we have very clear data that is one of the most powerful determinants of health, well-being, emotional stability, happiness, what makes life matter. And when you look back across your life course, what are the things that mean the most? And gosh, isn't the world learning that now? What matters more than anything is the people.
Yeah.
People we're being told we should socially isolate. We're just being asked to physically distance, not to become lonely and not to turn away from each other. And what is everyone struggling with more than anything is being told you can't be with other people.
Yeah.
And I think that is to remember that. And especially right now, there's so much focus on these words, social isolation, and we need to think, well, it's more about physical distancing. And we're quite fortunate that this has happened in a way in the internet era where we can stay connected.
Oh, yeah.
And I grew up in New Zealand. My husband grew up in Ireland. Neither of our families live in the country we live in. So for years, we have facilitated grandchildren relationships via Skype and FaceTime and email. I talk to my mum on FaceTime most days. So I don't feel disconnected from her because I've fostered that connection using a different way. And I think it's about feeling that you are connected with people that is important. We have to, I think, right now remember that.
Yeah.
We're physically distant, but stay emotionally, socially connected.
Yeah. So, Sarah, how do people find you if they want to know more about you and your work?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm on social media. I have my moments of being active on social media and other times when I take care of myself and duck away. But I play around a bit on Instagram. So on Instagram, I'm Sarah Marie Mackay. I'm sure hopefully you'll provide the link.
I will provide all the links.
2 E's. I have a website which is actually going through a bit of a revamp at the moment, but at the moment people can find it at yourbrainhealth.com.au. And if they go to yourbrainhealth.com.au/toolkit, there is a brain health toolkit that they can download, which contains some of my hand-picked tools and strategies will give people a bit of an insight into the world of brain science, but how they can use neuroscience in their lives and in the work that they do as well.
Cool. Well, I will definitely provide all those links in the show notes, and I hope people will check them out.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I hope just everyone stays connected, even though, my boys are quite fond of saying we're all in this together, but separately.
There you go. Yes.
And we've got to get back to basics.
Yeah.
Sleep.
I agree.
Sleep's a superpower. It passes the time. Sleep, try and get some exercise in and just keep loving those around us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being a guest today. I really appreciate you taking the time all the way across the world from me, and it was really great to connect.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure chatting.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Sarah Mackay. All of the resources, her book, her website, everything we talked about, all the links to potential resources are in the show notes. So you can find them at womanwarriors.com. It will be the latest episode. I also wanted to share that next month we are going to be hosted by a new sponsor, Upfinch Journaling. And I'm pretty excited to have a sponsor, for one, which means they are going to pay for some advertising. So you will be hearing some advertisements by me for their product, but I'm also excited to be partnering with them for the month of January. So you can find out more next month on how you can get a subscription to Upfinch. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you had good holidays. I hope you have a happy, happy, happy new year. Here's hoping that 2021 will be different, will be better, will be less traumatizing for all of us. Take care of yourselves. Treat yourself with kindness and love. Take care of your bodies this week. Ciao for now from this Woman Warrior.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Woman Warriors Podcast. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Music was written and performed by Andy Cush. If you'd like more information on this episode, you can find the show notes, the resources shared today, and links to the guest profiles at womanwarriors.com.